Cub Scout. And then when I was studying anthropology and archaeology at Wayne, our class took a field trip down to Fort Wayne to look at the museum collections that were located in temporary buildings in the old fort. And then when I graduated, after I graduated, I lost my deferment, and Uncle Sam said, "We want you for the United States Army. You'll report to Fort Wayne on October 7th of 1968. So I went there. When I got out of the Army, I applied for a curatorial position, junior curator at the Historical Museum, and was hired. And I started going back down to the fort to work in the collections buildings. I studied a lot of architecture, architectural drafting on my own time. And the director appointed me curator of architecture because I went out and salvaged materials from a lot of buildings, brought them back to the fort to store. And when we got money to restore some buildings at the fort, commanding officer's house being the first one, I was moved down there to work full-time at the fort, and I ended up being there 10 years restoring the commander's house. That took 6 years. The old Spanish-American War guardhouse, that took a couple of years. And finally I worked on the collections center and the old fort as well. So what you're looking at on the screen there is a map showing where Fort Wayne is located with respect to southwest Detroit. You can see the Rouge River coming into the Detroit River. I-75 is the double line near the top of the screen. And the two roads going down toward the fort are Livernois and Dragoon Street. Many of the streets around Fort Wayne have military names, Army, Cadet, Cartridge, etc. So the fort was built, as Mike said, to defend Detroit from British incursions. There were a lot of troubles between British-held Canada and the United States in the 1830s and 40s. People that living in Michigan at the time could remember the War of 1812, when Detroit was captured by the British and held for over a year, from August 1812 to September 1813. They did not want that to happen again, although the government moved very slowly. It took them another 30 years or so to appropriate the money to buy the land and build historic Fort Wayne. There was the Patriot War of 1837 and 1838 that you really don't study in your history books, but that was a series of revolts by both Canadians that wanted to free their country from British rule and also Americans that wanted to help them. So there were several battles that were fought on the Windsor side of the Detroit River in 1837 and 1838. There were also battles fought along the Niagara frontier. They were ruthlessly suppressed by the British, and also the American government did not want trouble being made by Canadian and rebels and American sympathizers. So they decided to defend the neutrality of the United States, to prevent any naval attack from the British naval base at Amherstburg, to build a fort on the most strategic spot on the Detroit River. That is the spot where it was narrowest and on the outside of a curve, so you could see further up and down the river from that point than any other. So the government appropriated the $250,000 to buy the land and build the fort. They sent out a young lieutenant of engineers named Montgomery Cunningham Meigs, a West Point graduate, born in Georgia to a military family, but he was a sympathizer of the North, and during the Civil War, he became Quartermaster General of the Union Army. So he moved out, moved his family, he was a newlywed, moved his family to Spring Mills Township, bought the land that you see in green there, which was part of several farms, and hired some contractors and hundreds of workmen to build the fort. The original square bastion fort, those little points that you see sticking out on the corner of the square fort are called bastions. This type of design was taught at West Point. It was based on French fort design that went back to the time of Sebastien Vauban in the 1600s. Anyway, the idea of those points sticking out was there was nowhere for your enemy to hide at the base of the wall. So basically it was a defensive fortification. It took them about 9 years to build the fort. during which time relations got better between the British and the American government. And when Biggs was done, after 9 years, he basically locked up the fort, turned the key over to a watchman and his family, and the fort sat there for 10 years, from 1851 to 1861. So in a nutshell, going on with the history, the fort was used as a major mustering center during the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was kind of a rest and recreation post for infantry garrisons that were brought back from the western frontier, and they stayed at the fort for usually 4 years and then rotated back to some other more strenuous duty. The infantry stayed at the fort, various units, until the 1920s. At that point, the Army was mechanizing, they were getting rid of all the horses and mules, and Fort Wayne became a major motor supply depot, and reached its really high point of use during World War II, when it was the world's largest military vehicle supply depot. It had staff of over 2,000, mostly civilians. More buildings were built over the intervening years for staff housing and warehouses during World War II. And during World War II, the fort also controlled our parking lot, which is now called the Michigan State Fairgrounds, where thousands of vehicles went through there. Not that many went through, actually, Fort Wayne. Mostly parts. We had railroad sidings, warehouses. We also controlled the Port of Detroit for shipping out things by water. After World War II, the fort kind of wound down. We had a little while as a control center for the various Nike missile bases that were located in the metro area. We had, in fact, in the book we have a picture of the soldiers looking at the radar screens going around and around, looking for those Russian bombers that never came, fortunately. It was also used as the induction center for soldiers that I mentioned. I was one from the Korean War up through the Vietnam War era. The military gradually moved out in the 1960s, and the induction center was the last portion of active military, and that ended in 1970. So there's still a corner of the fort called the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Boatyard. They're all civilian employees that handle the boats that make sure the channels out in the lake are deep enough for the freighters. So in a nutshell, I've covered the 100 and some years history of the fort. Any questions so far? And I will go on with my slide talk.
How many acres?
The fort is 83 acres, and right now we've got around 40 buildings. So I'm going to show you a lot of those buildings. So this is a plan of the fort as it was. The area outlined in red is the Corps of Engineers boatyard. The area in yellow is the old Star Fort that went to the Detroit Historical Museum in 1949. The area outlined in green went to the Historical Museum in 1971. And finally, the area in brown went to the Historical Museum in 1976. So the river would be at the bottom of the picture. On the north edge is West Jefferson Avenue, originally what was called the River Road. So a lot of those buildings that you see, like the large warehouse that backs up to the river, is no longer in existence. So here's a shot of the fort, an aerial shot taken by an Army photographer shortly after World War II. And you can see the big building 9, the warehouse along the river, lots of vehicles, the other warehouses on the left. We have 6 of those big 27,000 square foot warehouses. 3 of them still remain, are in use, storing collections for the Detroit Historical Museum. You can see there are rows of houses along West Jefferson. The first row along the street was used by the sergeants. Those are duplex houses. There's a row of homes facing the parade ground, that lawn area in the center of the picture. Those were the officers' houses, built in 2 different stages. I'll tell you more about those later. And then you can see the old Star Fort that has temporary buildings kind of plunked down in the center of it when this picture was taken. Those are World War II storage buildings. And on the north side you have kind of a mixed area of residential and industrial buildings. There's a railroad that runs about a block north of Fort Wayne. It's now in Norfolk Southern. So here's an aerial shot, again, taken a few years later. You can see we still have the World War II buildings and the pavement inside the old fort. You can see the large warehouse backing up to the river and the width of the Detroit River. Those of you who are familiar with the Detroit 15 or 20 years ago will recognize the bow boat on the left in the Detroit River heading down to a bow boat. Okay, here's another shot taken around 1976. At this point, the large building along the riverfront, office and warehouse, has been torn down. The old fort has been cleaned up. The World War II sheds, the wood sheds, had been removed. And also you will see a large parking lot on the left. That parking lot was the site of the induction center that those of us who went through it will never forget. You can see the orientation with respect to downtown Detroit. It's approximately 3 miles downriver from downtown. As I mentioned, the fort was not Detroit when it was first built. It was Wayne County's Spring Wells Township. Evidently there were flowing springs there. It was not incorporated into the city until 1912. The fort was famous for prehistory. You can't really see it here, but in front of one of the officers' house is a 1,000-year-old Indian mound that still remains. It was partially excavated in 1976, and more excavations were done professionally during World War II, and it estimated that 50 skeletons came out of that mound, along with a lot of pottery, a particular type of pottery called Fort Wayneware, and stone ornaments, and copper ornaments from the Upper Peninsula that came out of the mound. The skeletal material that was taken out in World War II went to the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropology. They also found a dog skeleton that had been buried in the mound. There are still more skeletons that were sticking out of the sidewall of the excavation. They have been left there, so the mound is pretty much fenced off and regarded as a sacred site to Native Americans. It was built by the Adena or Hopewell culture. There's been no link made between those people and the tribes that were in the area when the first Europeans came through. There's another shot, aerial view. We have a beautiful grassy parade ground of 20 acres or so on the riverfront, which is still there. And if you went there now, you would see about 10 soccer fields that are on that big field. That's how we get the grass cut. Looking downriver here, you can see industry. There was a huge power plant it was our next door neighbor. It was built in 1903 by the Detroit Edison Company. That was their first major power plant. That was torn down about 15 years ago. So now we don't get the smog from the power plant, but the air has really improved over the last 15 or 20 years. But there's still coke ovens on Zug Island, and occasionally we can smell those. So here's a better shot of the old fort showing the Barracks building designed by Montgomery Meigs. The original drawings for this building still exist in the National Archives. The fort was first recognized as a historic site by the Historic American Building Survey of 1934. This was a Depression program that had contingents in every state that recorded the most historic structures. So there are 14 sheets of drawings of the old fort that are accessible on the internet. The original drawings are in the Library of Congress. So you can see a lot of gun emplacements inside the fort. As far as we know, those never had guns mounted on them, with the exception of one signal gun. But the fort had some cannons that were shipped out to be installed on the upper gun emplacements. Right before the Civil War, the Secretary of War, Mr. Floyd, was a Southern sympathizer, and he had the guns shipped from Fort Wayne to Texas because he knew they were going to be used by the Confederates down south after the country split up. So the stark wall, which is the high wall there, is 22 feet high and 6 feet thick. When Meigs originally built the stark wall, it was faced with wood. So by the time the Civil War came along, the wood was pretty rotten. So the government appropriated another $300,000 to rebuild the scarp wall and the tunnels and everything in brick and masonry. So that's why it still has survived as well as it has. So you can see we put some paths, concrete paths in the old fort around 1990 to provide handicapped access. And during the digging, we discovered an archaeological feature. So you can see that little square right in the center of the old fort parade ground. And that was the remains of a mortar mill. And imagine a flat stone bed, circular, about 20 feet in diameter, with brick walls on the inside and outside. And then there would have been a giant iron wheel with paddles on it, with an axle in the center. And on the outside of the axle, going round and round, would have been an unfortunate mule. Because tons and tons of mortar had to be mixed to build the barracks. The barracks is about 150 feet wide, and it is a 4-story building built out of stone that was brought up from an island in Lake Erie, Kelly's Island, limestone. So the fort had its own dock, and they shipped the stone up, and then the workers hauled it up in wagons and built it. The barracks was divided into 5 sections internally, and was designed to house 5 companies of 100 men each. So there's a mess hall and kitchens on the first floor in each section, 2 floors of barracks rooms, and the top floor are smaller rooms that would have been used by sergeants or bachelor officers. So this is going back in time to the 1890s. This is the way Officers' Row looked at that time. The original Civil War officers' quarters were all gone. They were in bad condition, except for the second building down the road with kind of the Dutch gambrel roof. So that, unfortunately, that was the original commander's house from the Civil War, and it was torn down in the 1930s by the Army, so there's a gap now. The other buildings of Officers' Row were designed in Washington, D.C. for the climate of Washington, D.C., and they were framed Victorian cottage type structures. They had a great view of the river. Officers could sit out on those verandas and watch the sailing ships and the steamships going by, watch the troops parade on the big parade ground. You can see, well, this one doesn't have a bandstand, but the bandstands have come and gone. We've had 3 different bandstands, and every one of which evidently has either rotted or blown away in the tremendous windstorms that we had. So there were a lot of horses and mules around, so they had to have a lot of fences to keep them under control. The roads were basically sandy gravel. The soil at the fort is very sandy. And here you can see the Indian Mound. So these homes were bricked up by the WPA program during 1937 and 1938. So most of them are still there, but except for the one we restored, you wouldn't recognize them as being framed Victorian structures. And here's one of the first brick buildings that was built at the fort. Was the Fort Hospital. Was built, the part that you see was built in 1889. It was later expanded in the 1890s. And next week, because it has fallen into ruinous condition, it will be torn down. It's a very sad event that's going to take place.
Will you preserve anything or save bricks?
It's being funded by the Army Corps of Engineers, and the whole building is considered contaminated with asbestos and lead. So maybe if I sneak in after the contractors leave, I can save a few bits of it. That structure in the foreground with the white curving roof that looks like the deck house of a sailing ship, that is a cover for a stairway that goes down into one of the cannon chambers in the walls. It would have covered every square inch on the bottom of the moat outside the scarp wall. Fort has a moat, but it is a dry moat, but it's very near to the water table, so no one could tunnel under the moat and undermine the wall. So the fort was ingeniously designed by Lieutenant Meigs for defensive purposes. In fact, when he left the fort, he was Captain Meigs and had, I think, 9 children.
Is he related to anybody working in some moment?
I don't believe he is related to the Meigs, Governor Meigs of Ohio. He said just a different family. This you're looking at Officers Row from the parade ground. It was taken probably with a view camera in the 1890s. And the fort had a streetcar line that came out from downtown Detroit. It's called the Fort Wayne and Elmwood Railway. I've noticed there have been stock certificates for sale on eBay of the Fort Wayne and Elmwood Railway recently. So every Sunday when the weather was good, people could take the streetcar line out and they could have a picnic on the parade ground and they could watch the troops in their dress uniforms drill and be serenaded by the regimental band. The fort was the headquarters of an infantry regiment which had a band, and watch the ships go up and down the river. And before they filled in the shoreline, people used to swim at the fort as well. But, so the shoreline was very swampy, and malaria, which they called ague, was quite a problem for the health of the troops. Okay, this kind of shows 3 stages of Officers Row. On the left, this was taken in the 1930s. On the left, you have the original appearance. These buildings, because of the pollution coming in from downriver with the prevailing west winds, they were very difficult to maintain. So the Army at first tried doing the scheme that you see on the building on the right, which was taking off the wood siding, covering it with asbestos cement shingles. So they had a wonderful color scheme. We know because we found the shingles when we restored that building. The first floor was white, the second floor was red, and the trim was blue. So fortunately, they decided to kind of colonialize these buildings when they bricked them up. So they cut down on the size of the windows, they took off the dormers, and they did the scheme, which later became the Officers Club, for the building that you see in the middle, Building 109. These buildings all had numbers, of course. Everything in the Army had a number, including me. So this is that same building that you saw in the middle there. That's the way we found it when we acquired that section of the fort for the Historical Museum. During the Detroit riots in 1967, a lot of families had been displaced. By that time, the Army officers had moved out of these houses. So the city worked out a deal with the Army so that their housing department could place displaced families in these homes. So unfortunately, though, when the families moved out, they did not vandalize the buildings, but there was kind of a limbo of security, and so vandals got into the fort and stripped a lot of these buildings of their windows, sash weights, copper and brass wiring and plumbing, copper roofing, gutters, and downspouts. And a lot of expensive damage was caused at that point. The Historical Museum started to restore them. So this was the one. It's funny how that cross kind of mysteriously appeared on the front door. So this was the commander's house. It's called Building 110. And this one unfortunately suffered a severe fire. You can see the big hole in the roof. That's just a small portion of the burned out area that went from the basement all the way up through the roof, as you see. So we knew we'd have to do something drastic, either tear it down or restore it. So we determined to try and raise the money to restore this building. It took several years to raise the money. Work had to be done in 2 stages, exterior work and interior work. The work started in 1980, and the house was finally completed in 1986. We were greatly assisted by the Kresge Foundation. They gave us $150,000. The state of Michigan, back when they had money in a historic preservation account, they gave us $50,000. And the colonial dames gave us not only money, but a lot of work in researching the house, finding antiques, restoring antiques, and buying antiques. So, the Colonial Dames organization is still supporting the house with the grant of money for restoring some of the exterior porches and stairways. So the next series of slides will show you the progress of restoration. Remember I mentioned the red, white, and blue color scheme. Well, when we stripped off the brick, there it was. See the blue corners there. And when we took off the tar paper, you could still see the ghosting of the original clapboards that the Army builders had put on there in 1880. So a lot of new structure. Basically, the whole middle of the back wing was gone and had to be rebuilt. And the WPA had unfortunately poured a new foundation to rest the brick veneer on. And so that had to be cut off to expose the original brick foundation. So that was a big job. It's the biggest concrete saw I've ever seen. And so there's the house getting ready for its new structure and new finishing. New back porch. We were fortunate to have the original drawings and a pretty good collection of photographs to base the restoration on. The exterior. The dormers going back up. This was the first phase where the contractors restored the exterior. With windows, with clapboard going up there. Wood shingles in abundance. So we did testing to see what the original colors were for the exterior. It turned out they were, and we had black and white pictures, but we knew the body of the house was pretty close to white. We didn't know what color the trim was, so we did testing. Found out it was kind of a chocolate brown. And there it was, getting ready for its interior restoration. And so the interior took several years more, doing all plastering and finishing, a new trim, new mantles. And also we had a lot of research done on the original family that lived in the house. It turned out the commander that built the house and was the first occupant was a colonel named Henry Boynton Clitz, C-L-I-T-Z, who had connections to Detroit. And this was his last post before he was going to retire. So he was a lifelong bachelor, commander of the 10th Infantry Regiment at the time. And he moved in there with his mother, who was getting kind of elderly, and his widowed sister-in-law was there, and her daughter. So we restored the interior to fit the people that we know were living there. Henry Boynton Clitz, as I mentioned, he came from a military family, grew up in Detroit and Mackinac Island, went to West Point, graduated, I think, in time to serve in the Mexican War. And then he also continued in the Army, served in the Civil War, was captured by the Confederates. He was wounded in his leg. He was about to lose his leg when one of his former West Point colleagues, who was a Confederate officer, was talking to him and said, "I can find you a better doctor who will save your leg," and he did. So we have a picture of that Confederate officer in the back parlor. It's on that little center table. And then we also we found a painting in the Historical Museum collection that showed Chapultepec Castle, which was a battle in the Mexican War in Mexico City. And just happened to be in the collection. So that's hanging over the mantle, which you can't see on the right. And then we made the back parlor kind of like Colonel Klitz's study.
How tall are the ceilings?
On the first floor there are 11-foot ceilings. They were designed for that Virginia climate, you know. Their surgeons' reports of the fort, which we have on microfilm, they were constantly complaining about how cold and drafty these houses were. They were wonderful in the summer. The breeze blew right through them. Very cold in the winter. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, this is across the hall from The front parlor is Mrs. Klitz's room. We know it was a bedroom. It shows up on the original plan on the first floor. So she didn't have to climb those high stairs. And then this is the restored kitchen. We opened it for Civil War days this year. It doesn't get opened, it's under the jurisdiction of the Detroit Historical Society now. So we have to have very qualified and experienced people that open it up, because it does contain priceless original artifacts. So hopefully we can find someone to open it up for the upcoming Fort Wayne Flea Market on October 13th and 14th. And we hope you can come. Okay, and there's some of the reenactors. You can see the lace curtains that show up on the original photographs we found. The colonial Danes actually found replicas of those to fit our extremely high windows. And even the planting is as authentic as we could make it from the 1880s photographs, with the flowering rose there in the front one and those wild morning glories growing up on the porch. And although no one's planted morning glories there for about 15 years, when I was walking by the house the other day, there's still a patch of morning glories coming up. They're very persistent for annuals. And we've had different events there. We had the band concerts occasionally. They put them up on the porch and made it into a bandstand. We don't have any of the original bandstands. We only have our plans of the bandstand. And then this is another building behind the commander's house. This was the Spanish-American War guardhouse, built in 1889, and it was later converted into the post office and signal corps center, radio and telephone center. So again, we found some money in the city budget to restore this building. And took out the addition in the back. This one had been vandalized. The roof was leaking for a long time. Very bad conditions inside. This demolition. We found postings of the original cells. The guardhouse had two functions. Basically, it was kind of the post security center. It was the center where the guards would go out to walk their various posts around the fort. Also, that's where the prisoners would have been held, either for some kind of punishment work or waiting trial in the military court-martial system. So there's postings of the cells on the back wall, which would be on your left. Cells had brick walls going over the top. No way could a person get out of those cells. If you tried to tunnel through the floor, there were these huge beams that were 3 inches apart, so you weren't going out that way either.
How many cells were there?
There were 4 high security cells, and then there were 2 kind of low security cells for the run-of-the-mill drunks and AWOLs and things of that nature. Part of it was crumbling away. So working on the exterior of the building, it was a tremendous job rebuilding all the fancy cornices. The bricks had been sandblasted. They were very rough and irregular. They did not look right. So contractors actually took down the outer width of brick, turned it around so that the face would be smooth and related. There they are working on the bricks. Masonry. Yeah, the Army would have sandblasted it. Sandblasting was okay for a long time before we discovered that the long-term damage that it would have done. These guardhouses, we've had 3 guardhouses at the fort. There was the Civil War vintage wood guardhouse. It looked very similar to this, again built in wood. They had a big wide porch. And then this is number 2, later converted into the post office, as I mentioned. And then around 1905, they built guardhouse number 3, which is right near our front gate, which also has a big wide porch. So every army post in the country, maybe in the world, has changing of the guard every day. And before the guards can go on duty, they have to be inspected. So there are 3 ranks of guards, typically the way the American Army does it. There's like 3 shifts. You're on guard duty for 2 hours on, 4 hours off, rotating around the 24 hours of the clock. And so to inspect the guards, they have to line up in 3 rows. So when it was raining, we would line up under the porch. When it wasn't raining, they would line up between the porch and the street. And we have a picture of the guards being inspected in the 1890s. So we have the officer of the day and the sergeant of the guard were in charge of the security of the post. Okay, that's the back. We didn't know what the back originally looked like because all we had was a floor plan, no elevation on the back. But the museum sent me to the National Archives, and misfiled, I found a picture of the back as it was originally built. There was an old picture, so we were able to judge the height of the windows and determine which ones were original. Again, same thing for the back wall. And we've also found the original specifications in the National Archives. And they said that the interior walls would be stained and penciled. So we didn't know what the heck is staining and penciling, and then we exposed the wall, and there it was, where the mortar joints were kind of crude and rough. But to make them look uniform, they stained the whole wall brick red. And then to make them look even more uniform, they found a painter with a very steady hand who would paint in those mortar joints about 1/4 of an inch wide. So that's, if you go into the guardhouse, which is usually open on weekends, you can see the original staining and penciling, which we have preserved. There's the interior near completion, and that was the way it looked when we finished restoring it in 1983. You notice on the right-hand end of the porch, there are some horizontal bars. And those were where the fire buckets hung, because this was out in the sticks. This was Springwells Township, and there was no handy fire department. The guards also served as the post fire department, so they would have brought their buckets and formed a bucket brigade from the nearest water source to put out fires. I should mention also the interior of the guardhouse has been furnished. And we have reproduction bunks with nice oak boards to lay on, just like they were originally had when the guards were there in the 1880s and 90s. Okay, here's another shot taken later of the back of the hospital. The hospital steward's house is back in there, and that little building on the left was the post-mortuary called the dead house. And the dead house was actually moved, and it existed across West Jefferson until somebody set fire to it. They added on another wing to it to provide a little more space. And I'm sure the people would have been mortified if they had known they were living in the dead house. And that was the fancy wrought iron fence, a little of which exists along the side property, but otherwise we have all chain link with barbed wire facing West Jefferson. And this is one of the sergeant's houses. This one happened to have been built in the 1930s. And again, these places were vandalized. They had copper sheathing on the front portico porch there, and vandals got that, so a lot of rot took place. You can see the damage. And this one, we got the money to restore because of Coleman A. Young. Mary Young had been a Tuskegee Airman in World War II, and there were a number of other airmen that wanted to start a museum in the Detroit area. So he found us enough money to restore Building 210. So, and that was our goal, to make it look like it did originally. And we got good support from a class out at Lawrence Tech Architecture School. And they drew up this grand idea for an atrium inside, turning this duplex house into a museum with a high atrium we could hang model planes from. And so that's what we did. So if you come there today, the Tuskegee Airmen still have it open. You can see their planes they trained in. The actual sign they stole from the railroad station where they used to get off to transfer to go to Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama, Chehaw Junction. So we have a model of the Tuskegee Army Airfield, maps where they trained. There's many of them trained at Selfridge Field. And then where they were stationed overseas in North Africa, following General Patton across North Africa and then up into Italy where the war ended. They had us. Only the fighter pilots actually served in combat. The bomber crews, of which Coleman Young was going to be one, war ended before they were finally ready to go into action. But the fighter crews had a tremendous record of, they never lost a bomber that they accompanied into combat. They were basically guarding bombers going to fly into northern Italy and Germany. And many of them were shot down and captured. We have authentic uniforms from the airmen. And there's that atrium. Mr. Downs fledging that he passed away a couple of years ago. And, the airmen donated a lot of their snapshots and memorabilia from the war that we have on display in their patches.
Jim, I think it's important to mention that is not like the Grand Army of the Republic, that there were any of us in this room could be a member of the Tuskegee Army.
Yes, we are looking for members, and they have a lot of youth career programs. Get a lot of school groups going through their museum.
Is that building controlled by the historical museum or the city of Detroit? Or the Army themselves?
Neither. It is actually run by the airmen.
Okay.
So they have an agreement with the city. The city pays the utilities for the building, and they staff it and handle all their tour reservations.
So is it open at regular hours or just for
They're usually there on weekends, otherwise it's by appointment. And they have an honor roll of the airmen that gave their lives during World War II. And that is a 4-foot by 8-foot piece of marble. And there's their combat aircraft, the Mustang P-51. And that's the way it looks today. It's right near the front gate of the fort. We also have a lot of support from the Civil War reenactors, which were kind of the nucleus of the historic Fort Wayne Coalition, the leader of which, Mr. Berlucci, is sitting in the back there. And they are now 180 strong. And besides putting on our big Civil War Days event in July, they come in on a regular basis and do all kinds of jobs, both fun and nasty, to maintain the fort. So they're chopping down trees and roofing and painting and getting support from other groups as well. They are a great asset to the fort, and we greatly appreciate all the work that they put into place and their enthusiasm. So this is a scene, typical scene from one of our Civil War Days events that we've held over the years. And over the years, we've also had concerts, recreation department, which is now running Fort Wayne. They started a series of concerts. They've also leased out the fort, especially for Hispanic fiestas. And we had the biggest event ever held at the fort in August, when they had a Hispanic fiesta. They had 15,000 people over a weekend. We've had the Detroit Symphony out there and many different bands over the years playing on a beautiful riverfront setting. So we've also used the old fort for concerts as well. We used to have them every year. We would have them on July 3rd, Independence Eve, we call them. Lately we've had events open the fort for the fireworks night as well. And lastly, we have a full-size gymnasium there, and we are going to have our giant flea market there. We have about 90 dealers, and it will be held, as I mentioned before, on October 13th and 14th. The flea market is free, but they do charge a parking fee, I think $3, maybe up until $5, since the city is poor. But we'll have reenactors will be there. We'll be giving tours. I will give tours, and we'll also have a mess hall operating with good food at a reasonable price. Those ladies refuse to raise their prices year after year, so it's amazing that they can make money pay for their food. So I think that concludes my talk. So I also want to mention that I have this This Arcadia book that is hot off the press that came out in April, myself and my co-author David Jamrose, who is a longtime Fort Wayne volunteer, a West Point graduate, and he was an engineer at Ford Motor, retired, looking for another project, so the two of us decided to put together this book. So this covers a lot of the pictures that you've seen, a lot more than what I've gone into here in detail. So I'm selling them for $20 a piece, and I'd be happy to autograph them. So, yes, thanks.
Last time I was there, they were restoring that Chinese theater. I was wondering if they were just going to put that on exhibit or use it for anything.
Well, we have a theater at the fort. It was built, it opened in 1939, I think, for Gone with the Wind. That seats 140. And we had a group that was working on the theater for a long time called the Fort Wayne Guard. And it is still in progress. We're working on the exterior. To do the interior at this point would be the better part of $1 million, because it is in very bad condition. The roof was let go. It has a new roof on it that we got a grant for. It cost $100,000. And so basically our goal is to make the outside look good. And, if some angel comes along someday that wants a theater named after them, we'd be happy to take that money. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's the best way to get there for the outing?
From here, Fort Wayne is off of I-75, exit 46, it's just beyond the Ambassador Bridge. So you take I-94 to 75 south, and it's not too far beyond downtown. And if you get off exit 46, which is Livernois exit, and you turn left on Livernois, Livernois runs right into our front gate. It's about 3 blocks from the freeway to the gate. We
You
have
can also take Jefferson to downtown.
West Jefferson,
And
they-
4th Street or 4th Street.
it doesn't go through. Yeah, I can take 4th Street and then turn left on Livernois.
That's right.
So it's easy to get to. It's 14 miles from here, which is I drive it every day. I live here. Yes, Mr. Fleet?
Jim, you didn't describe the warehouses there, other than the one or three are in use.
Yeah, we still have 3 of those warehouses. They're under the jurisdiction of the Detroit Historical Society, and they are used to store the historical collections of the city of Detroit. So we have something like 250,000 items in storage down there. The one warehouse 2C has been completely renovated on the inside. It's got museum quality conditions, and that's the best storage facility that we have. There's another warehouse 2B where we keep vehicles. It has a good roof but no heat. The vehicles are in these inflated bubbles to keep the dust off them and the air circulating. There's also museum items stored in about 5 other buildings at the fort. So those are basically under the control of the Detroit Historical Museum, which is run by the Detroit Historical Society. So they have volunteers working there. In fact, my wife is one of the volunteers who's working in storage down there as well. They are slowly digitizing the records of those 250,000 artifacts. It takes a long time to input all that data into the computer and take a picture of the items. And I think they're up to probably about 50,000 now after 3-4 years. Yes.
The original fort, describe the gate you go through, the tunnel almost.
Okay, yes, the original fort, the only way in originally was through these tunnels. They're actually, if you can imagine, a brick. It's got stone walls with a brick vault going over your head. It's about 100 feet long, and you enter through a set of double gates that are 6 inches thick. One set opens out, one set opens in. And there's several rooms. The casemate galleries where the cannons were originally to be located before Secretary of War Floyd shipped them away. You can go in there, you can actually see a room that has not changed since the Civil War, when it was rebuilt in brick and stone. And those tunnels are in very good shape. We also have found graffiti on the tunnel walls, where some of the soldiers had a lot of time on their hands, maybe on guard duty, they were bored. So on the sides of the tunnels that you can't see from inside the fort, a lot of them have scratched their names, and there are some dates there as well. In fact, some of them we actually have some information on that we've actually found him. One gentleman, Private Cowan, we actually found his grave. Fort Wayne used to have a cemetery. In fact, in the book there's a plan of the cemetery with over 100 graves. And about 1900, when they were rebuilding parts of the fort, they moved the entire cemetery down to Woodmere Cemetery on West 4th Street. So there is a military section that you can visit at Woodmere that has a lot of the soldiers and their families that died for one reason or another in Fort Wayne. So some of their families, some of the veterans, like Private Cowan, he retired from the Army, but he wanted to be buried at the Fort Wayne Cemetery section of Woodmere. So he's there, his wife is there as well.
And the barracks built, 1848, I believe?
Yeah, the cornerstone was laid in 1848, but it took them 3 years to build the building.
Is that still open with exhibits, or?
The only exhibits left are the mess hall, which has the tables and benches, and the bunk room where you can see these little narrow bunks where two guys had to sleep during the Civil War. So you can go through those. The building used to be filled with exhibits, but when we got $2 million from Wayne County to renovate the barracks, we had the goal of, once the building renovation was done, to put new exhibits in. Well, we never got the money to do the new exhibits, so we have some plans to eventually put some exhibits in there. Besides I mentioned the Fort Wayne Coalition, which is a great support group. We also have a support group that's about 25 years old called the Friends of Fort Wayne. They have some money, and occasionally they kick in, and they may be interested. And one of the other organizations might be interested in supporting an exhibit or finding someone to put their name on an exhibit. So there's tremendous military collections and Indian collections, thanks Mike, down at the fort and Historical Society storage. So possibly with enough security, those could be drawn on. And we had an Indian museum at the fort in one of the buildings down there, and it used to be a magnet for school kids. But the roof started leaking, there was no money to fix the roof, and so the artifacts were put into secure storage. So, more questions? Yes, sir.
There's a General Montgomery Meigs who is either still active or recently retired. Do you know if there's any connection?
I wouldn't be surprised if he wasn't some kind of descendant or distant relative of Montgomery Cunningham Meigs. I think they have a long, he had quite a few kids. In fact, one of his sons, I believe, was killed during the Civil War. I don't know for sure, but I would bet that there's some distant ancestry going back to the Quartermaster General of the Union Army. Many of you have probably seen the President's inaugural balls that are held in the Pension Building, huge atrium with these huge columns. Well, that was designed by Montgomery Meigs after the Civil War. He was still, he stayed in the Army his whole career. He's got pictures of himself and his house are in the Library of Congress website. So I've got a picture of him in the book as well. So any other questions?
Please stick around.
Thank you very much.
Sign books.
I will be happy to send
Any more questions?
for you if you like.
Thank you all.